There's a clip. You can flip it or stick it in your pocket.
Let me see. That's the button.
That turns it on and off.
Okay.
If you'll just leave it on, I can mute it from here.
Okay. Well, I don't know where to clip it at this point because
This is the part you're speaking into. So yeah, so it can go just anywhere.
All right, I'll just put it in my pocket.
Sorry about all the wire.
It's okay.
So do you want this on your lapel then?
I think so. I'll have matching ones then.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just have to remember to turn them on. Actually,
just leave it on and I'll
okay, I think I'll turn them both on before I go down there, and it may make a little noise, but I prefer that.
Okay, well I think it's on now because I just turned it on.
Okay, it's just this one has a button that I have to
right.
push.
This one you can just ignore. I'll just go ahead and mute it here until you're ready to speak.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Hi Eastside, thank you so much for having us here today. I can't say too much more than Mr. Williams, but I definitely want to thank all of you for being here today. The Holocaust is something that we can never, ever forget. And as we get further and further away from the Holocaust, it becomes more and more difficult for us to have these sort of first-hand accounts that are out there for us to really learn what the Holocaust was like. We are lucky, though, that there are still the children of Holocaust survivors around and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors that are keeping these stories alive so that we do what the Holocaust Museum says, which is to never forget, because we never want something like this to happen again here or anywhere else in the world. And so today, I think you guys are really lucky because you get to see in person a fantastic speaker who is going to relate and make the Holocaust more personal, because all of us can say 6 million died in the Holocaust, till we're blue in the face, but what does that really mean? What does that really look like? And so we're going to try and put a bit of a human face on that for you today so you can understand the importance of the Holocaust and the human tragedy that it was. I am very thankful to the Jewish Council of North Central Florida because they've been working with me for a number of years to make sure that we have events like this so that you get these kind of educational experiences. And so I do want to introduce somebody from the Jewish Council who is going to say a few words and introduce our speaker. That is Ms. Jenna Price.
Good morning. Thank you to all of you students and the staff at Eastside High School for allowing us to come for Holocaust Education Week. Again, my name is Jenna Price. I work with the Jewish Council to bring accurate and meaningful Holocaust education to the schools and the community. I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kenneth Wald. He is the son of Holocaust survivors. He's an author and also a professor emeritus at the University of Florida. I truly hope that you're inspired by his story and that you're encouraged to share with your friends, family, and community. All right, let's give him a round of applause. Here he is.
Okay, see you on the other side. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and I do mean here in this auditorium, because the last time I was here, my younger daughter was graduating from Eastside High School. My other daughter went to GHS, so I guess that kind of offsets it, but I want to give a shout out not just to the people in the room, but to those of you in other schools around the county today. And again, I want to echo Jenna's thanks to all of those, including Jenna, who have made this possible. I'm really glad to hear that most of you are being taught about the Holocaust, and I know from personal experience that's not the easiest topic to think about. The Holocaust was so vast, so all-encompassing, so cruel, that it's difficult to get your head around it. And that's why most people who talk about the Holocaust try to talk about not a whole country or a region or an ethnic group, but to talk about a family. Because it's at the level of the family that you really understand the cost of what happened during those fateful years when 6 million Jews and 4 million other groups, Russian soldiers, Seventh-day Adventists, and other groups that were targeted, gypsies, also died. Can we go to the slide, please? I'm going to talk about the Schenwald family. In German, the word Schenwald means beautiful forest, and that was the family's name. And as far as we know, they first arrived in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, in the early 1800s. I'm going to be talking about the last two generations of that family, not the only ones, but the two. I'm going to be talking about Kurt Schenwald and his wife, Regina Zadek. They were my grandparents. And then I'm going to be talking about their oldest son, Heinz Werner Schenwald, who, when he arrived in the United States, changed his name to Henry Wald. There is actually a book about the family that was published on the 60th anniversary of the Kristallnacht riot, which we'll be talking about later on. A friend of mine was very interested. He's the Lutheran pastor of the small town in Germany, a place called Gross Rostorf, where the Schenwald family, those last two generations, lived. Unfortunately, the book is in German, so unless you speak German, you can't read that book. So we'll be talking about the more recent family members. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk to you about the process by which the Nazis turned my family into the enemies of Germany as they saw it. And this process really involved sort of three campaigns that were applied against Jews in increasing intensity. Jews were first of all dishonored. All of their contributions were ignored or denied. They were then degraded by the loss of many of the most basic freedoms that we take for granted. And then they were dehumanized, which essentially sent them to their deaths. And the pattern of the experience is fairly straightforward. First, my grandparents lost their social status, then they lost their freedoms, then their business and home were stolen from them, and then they lost their lives. You don't get a lot of happy endings in typical Holocaust stories, but to my mind, the ending of this story is more satisfactory than you would expect, because there was another stage for the Schoenwalds. Click, please. They have experienced something of an afterlife. Now, not perhaps in a literal sense, but the Schoenwald family, unlike most of the people who died in the Holocaust, and their names are no longer known, they have a history, and that history has come back to the town where they lived, and also come back to the town where I grew up, Lincoln, Nebraska, and to the town where I have lived for most of my life, Gainesville, Florida. And the story would be incomplete if I didn't bring it home by talking about that afterlife, something that gives me a lot of comfort. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start at the beginning. You see here Kurt on the right, of course, and his wife, Regina Schoenwald. They moved to the town of Grossroesdorf in 1919 to start a business. They sold mostly textiles, both textiles that were just cloth, but also ready-to-wear clothing. They enjoyed a great deal of respect and affection in the city because of several factors. Kurt had served in the German Air Force in World War I, and he emerged from that with two decorations. The first one, which you can see on his lapel, is called a fighter's ribbon, and it was given to people who showed courage when they were at or near the front in World War I. The second award, the second award, which was not worn on the clothing, was the Iron Cross Second Class, which was given for extreme courage in the face of danger. So Kurt was highly respected for his service to Germany in World War I. The family was also respected because they were known to be very kind and caring to members of their community. When I first visited Grossroesdorf in 2000, I met an elderly man who wanted to tell me a story. It seems that a worker in a textile factory nearby had gotten tangled up with the machinery and suffered severe injuries and was essentially going to bleed to death. There was no hospital in this town, so they would have to send him to another place to save his life. The employees went to the owner of the factory and asked him to drive this man to help, but this employee, I was told by this older man, this owner rather, I was told, didn't want somebody who would bleed all over his car. So the workers got together and said, who else in town has a car? And they remembered that Kurt Schoenwald, my grandfather, had one. They went to him and asked him if he was willing to drive the man to Dresden, where there was a hospital. And he immediately said yes, even though he had no relationship to the factory owner, or the man. And I'm happy to say, according to my informant, that the man was treated and his life was saved because of my grandfather's concern for him. And I heard other stories, not quite so dramatic, that reinforced how much they were appreciated. They were also philanthropists who gave generously to various charities. After World War I, which Germany lost, there were a lot of people who lived in substandard housing without the basic supplies you need to have good hygiene. So the city of Gross-Oberstdorf decided to build what was called a public bath. This is something you find all over Europe. It typically has, toilets, bathtubs, showers, and swimming pools, all of which enable people to maintain good hygiene. The Schönwalds were the major contributors to the building of this public bath, and people still remembered it, and indeed their picture is now on the walls when you go to that place in southeastern Germany. So they were well liked, and they would have told you if you had asked them in the 20s, they had a good life. The basis for that life financially was their store, which you see in the middle slide here. It was called the Kaufhaus Schönwald, which simply means the Schönwald department store. It was the biggest commercial facility in this relatively small town. And the store occupied the bottom two floors, and the top floor was where the family had their living quarters and other spaces that were rented out to doctors, lawyers, dentists, and so forth for professional offices. So it was considered a very, very nice place. And in fact, this picture is from a postcard about the town. You can tell from this little imprint down here. So it was something that the town was proud to have something like this. They had a chance to travel and take vacations. Here you see Kurt and Regina in the latest horse-drawn carriage of its day, I'm sure, taking a vacation to a part of Germany known as Saxon Switzerland. It wasn't Switzerland, but like Switzerland, it was mountainous, and that was terrain that they really enjoyed. And on the right, you see Kurt with his two children, Heinz and Suze, standing in front of some tourist attraction. Now, they're on vacation, but you look at Kurt standing at the bottom, immaculately dressed in the fashion of the day, a double-breasted suit, a tie, and looking to me like a bantam rooster who, to be honest, I wouldn't want to tangle with. He looks very determined. And then you see his son, Heinz, my father, and my aunt, Suze, sitting above. So life was good. Next slide. Until it wasn't. And in the 1920s, after World War I, a lot of movements emerged in Germany. And the one that ultimately mattered the most on the family's history was the development of the National Workers' Socialist Party, led by Adolf Hitler, whose symbol was the swastika. I'll be telling you more about that later on. In 1978, Heinz, now Henry, gave a talk at my synagogue in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he talked about how people reacted when Hitler did come to power in 1933. So let's click on that first slide, please, on the top.
Very quickly, to go back, this all started, at least on the surface, in 1923 with Hitler's revolt, which didn't come off. Hitler went to jail, wrote his infamous book, Mein Kampf, and we, as the Jewish population of Germany, made the mistake of not reading it. I personally must plead that I was a little too young for this sort of thing, but nevertheless, my parents and relatives and so on didn't read it soon enough. We started reading it in 1933, 4, 5, it was some such year, and by that time it was a little too late. Hitler came to power actually in January of 1933, and did precisely what he said he was going to do in the book which he had written while in prison.
What Hitler said in the book, Mein Kampf, My Testament, was that he wanted to make Germany free of Jews. He didn't say how he was going to achieve it. He didn't say why. He wanted the Jews out of Germany. Now, Jews at this time were 1, maybe 1.5% of the population, so they weren't a large community. But Hitler held them responsible for every bad thing that had ever happened to Germany. He made them the other. Now, My father then went on to talk about how the Jews in Germany in the 1930s, when Hitler was in power, felt to some degree that they were immunized against Hitler because of their educations, because of their contributions to the war. Whatever it was, they felt kind of immune to Adolf Hitler, despite the things that he had written in that book. Click, please.
Not a majority. Of course, my family, people whom we knew well, to us, this whole thing was not really serious. Whatever Hitler may or may not have had in mind, nothing was going to happen to us, we thought. For one thing, we were Germans. I have personally traced my family back some 300 years in Germany, and with the German mania for keeping records, that's not all that difficult. I was a high school senior when I did it. And there were any number of others who were in the same boat. I was born and raised in a small town, about 12,000 population. I went to school there, grade school, high school, went to university, and I knew all these people. They were friends of mine, so what were they going to do to us? Nothing. It didn't turn out that way.
Okay. Next slide, please. Upon taking power, Hitler began with the first phase of his war on the Jews. And in this phase, the goal was to make it so uncomfortable for Jews in Germany that they would leave. And several thousand did, but not everybody left. And part of the way they did this was to set the Jews aside from the rest of the population. There were Germans, and then there were Jews. And Jews who thought they were Germans soon learned that maybe they weren't. The way you do this, the way you other somebody, can be done in several ways. And I'm sure most of you have studied the way in which the Nazis required all Jews, wherever the Nazis found them, to wear armbands with the symbol of Judaism, the inverted triangles. Is that something you've seen or heard about? Okay, all right. Well, there are other ways of othering the people. And in the case of my grandfather, there was a very interesting way. You see on the left his birth certificate, and you notice that his parents gave him 3 common names: Kurt, Bernhard, Walter. Bernhard and Walter, if I'm pronouncing them in the German way. In 1939, when they left the small town to go back to Berlin, where they had been born and raised, I looked in the telephone directory of the time, and I found a listing for Kurt Schoenwald. But in this case, it's Kurt Israel Schoenwald. And I was very confused because Israel was not part of his name. Well, the Nazis made it part of his name. One of the laws they passed to make it uncomfortable for Jews said that if any Jewish person, male or female, who did not have a traditionally Jewish name, like Moses for men, Sarah for women, would have to take a state-mandated middle name. So all men who didn't have traditional Jewish names had to add Israel as their middle name, and women had to add Sarah. Now, I should point out, this Israel is not the state of Israel, which wasn't created until 1948. This is a term often used collectively for the Jewish people, the people Israel, or the Hebrew people. And what this essentially did, along with the armbands, is kind of put a target on their backs. There's something about these people that we have to watch very carefully. And even if you had no interaction or you didn't really know why, it sort of put them under suspicion. And that happened all over Germany. But there was a second way they were othered in their own community. Can I have the next slide, please, John? This is the entrance to the public baths that were built in Gross-Roseldorf, built, as I've said before, with the major contribution from Kurt and Regina Schoenwald. And it looks kind of like the entrance to every public swimming pool I've ever been in, but There's a sign here on the left. Another click, John? Right there. And when you enlarge it and read it, that sign says, "No dogs or Jews allowed." And so the Schenwalds, who had made the public baths possible, were not allowed to set foot in that building. In this case, they're not merely losing their honor, but when they're equated with dogs, you get the sense that maybe they're not even human, which is an important step toward what the Germans called the final solution. Okay, next slide. The effort to encourage Jews to emigrate did have some success. The family of Anne Frank, who you've heard of, they moved to Holland and others moved. But most Jews stayed put. And so the Nazis decided on a second phase that would be more aggressive. They would go after all the money and power that they thought Jews had. They would steal their businesses, their homes, and basically reduce them to paupers so they would have no reason to stay in Germany. And that happened, that campaign was kicked off on November 9th and 10th, and keep those dates in mind, November 9th and 10th of 1938. And I'll let my father describe what happened to him and to my grandfather.
Then along came November the 10th of 1938, also known as Christian Night. On that day, a young Polish Jew walked into the German embassy in Paris and shot, I think, the secretary of the German embassy. I believe the man died a day or two or three later. I'm not really sure about that. But this was a signal for one of the best staged, spontaneous uprisings ever known. The local Nazi groups, the stormtroopers, both brown and black shirts, and the Hitler Youth and so on started demonstrating. Now, we were living in this small town, incidentally, the only Jewish family in what would be considered a county in this country. And my father belonged to an organization similar to the American Legion, things of that kind. And my father and I were arrested. The term used was protective custody. Now, I'm sure to this day that we did not need any protection. These people, even though they were demonstrating up and down the street, there was only one street, this was a town 11 miles long and 2 blocks wide. We didn't need any protection, but we were arrested by the chief of police. The chief of police was a buddy of my father's. They had been together through World War I. And the chief of police, son, and I were fairly close friends. Our birthdays were one day apart. I'm the older one. And he was dating my younger sister from time to time. So we were arrested, and the chief of police took us to the city jail, which was housed in the city offices. And it was rather primitive, but it was clean. And he kept apologizing that he had to do this and so on and so forth. Well, during the night, we were picked up by a truck, and at this stage we were handcuffed. And we were taken to the next larger city, which was Dresden, you heard the name. And from there we got on the train and were taken to concentration camp, Buchenwald. And that train ride is something that 40 years later, I still remember. Not only were we handcuffed, but we were chained to the seats of that train. We were on that train for approximately 24 hours. We got on that train at about midnight, and we got off 24.
So my father goes on to say that the worst thing about being in this purpose-built city of terror, which is how Buchenwald is described, was the fact that all the people whose businesses had been stolen, whose incomes were now gone, whose houses were taken over, were brought to this camp, which was not equipped to deal with that many thousands of people. But the worst thing he said is that nobody knew how long they were going to be in for. You know, if you know what your sentence is, you can, count the days and so forth. But they had no idea. And for many of these people who were elderly and the like, this was just overwhelmingly depressing. The camp was ringed by a metal fence that was electrified. And around the fence, there were guards with machine guns. So if you wanted to take your own life, it was a simple matter of running at a guard to be shot or running to the fence, grabbing it, and being electrocuted. And my father said that he saw enough of those things happen for a lifetime. It's one of the few times I'd seen my father emotional when he talked about his experiences. So Kurt, my grandfather, was released on November 27th, about 3 weeks after he had originally been arrested. We don't know exactly when my father was arrested. But Kurt was released on the condition that he sell, and I'll underline that word sell, the family business, the Kaufhaus Schenwald, to an Aryan, the term that the Nazis used for what they thought was a purebred German. And Henry Heinz was also released, but on condition that he leave Germany within 24 hours. And he did. He got immediately to Czechoslovakia and then to Switzerland. Next slide, please. As promised, Kurt sold his business to a man from another town nearby who, in a letter to my father, he described as that louse. I'm sure he thought of worse words about the person who took the store. And then, just about 3 weeks after Kurt had been released, or just about a week since Kurt had been released on November 27th, the local newspaper printed an ad which welcomed shoppers to patronize the Kaufhaus Seifert, because once the Kaufhaus Schenwald, it was now the Kaufhaus Seifert, and it's the same building. Now you might have thought, okay, Kurt sold the business to this man so they would have enough money to live on. The Nazis decided, however, that they wanted not just to take the business, but to impoverish the Schenwald family. So initially, Seifert agreed to a purchase price that he was going to pay my grandfather, and he in turn would take over the mortgage that still existed on the building. The building was built in 1928, and so there was probably 15 years of a mortgage left, and that's normally how it's done. When you buy a house or a business, you pay a price to the owner, but the new owner has to then cover the problems, or the mortgage has to pay it off. The Nazis decided locally that Kurt Schenwald should be required to pay off the entire mortgage. And the cost of doing that ate up any profit, any income from the purchase price. So we don't call this as a sale. In fact, Germans of the day had a term for it. They call it a shadow sale, because it looks like a sale, but in reality, it's just stealing the store. So Kurt eventually went back to Gross-Rotterdorf with his wife, and they ultimately returned to Berlin because they had no reason to stay here anymore. And the Kaufhaus Seifert took the place of the Kaufhaus Schenwald. Would you click, please, John? There was something my father did say. On the front of the business, it's covered now, you have this thing painted, and it says in English, although it's in German, built 1928 CS. CS being my grandfather, Kurt Schenwald, his initials. Apparently, Kurt was especially angry that they didn't even have to change that because Karl Seifert also had CS initials. And apparently that just really bothered him terribly, apart from the injustice of the whole process. Okay. So in Berlin, Kurt and Regina did have enough money to rent an apartment, And they spent most of their time doing two things. The first was trying to get visas so they could move from Germany to the United States. Heinz, their son, had arrived in Germany in 1939, in the United States, in New York, in 1939, and so they had a reasonable chance of getting immigration authorization because their son was gainfully employed in the United States. And the other thing that they did is prepare for a life in the United States. They both went to English language classes, reading and conversation and the like. And in addition, they developed skills that might be useful. My grandfather had worked in a distillery when he was a young man, so he took classes to refresh his knowledge. So he thought he could work in the alcohol industry. My grandmother, who had a cook in the house, basically learned how to cook very well, and she was going to perhaps be a caterer in the United States. And they were expecting to work together with my father once they had left Germany and arrived here. But things don't always go according to plan. Next slide, please, John. As they were waiting for all the papers to be completed, Kurt Schoenwald was ordered to work as a slave laborer in Berlin. Now, he was in his mid-60s, so he wasn't a young man at that point. But he was assigned to a company called Erich and Gratz in Berlin, who made electrical supplies. I found my grandfather's files in one of the state archives in Germany. And in it, the Erich and Gratz company attested, that is confirmed, they had employed Kurt Schoenwald during 1942. Now, look at this man for a second and compare him with the man you saw in the portrait with his wife or standing in front of that tourist attraction. That man looks straight into the camera. This picture from my grandfather's employee ID card, you notice this man is not looking into the camera. He's looking away. The Kurt in those earlier pictures you saw had either a slight smile on his face, or he actually had a very firm facial on his face, very firm mouth. Here he just, again, it's not the same man. And while he was always immaculately dressed in the earlier pictures, here he's got a somewhat threadbare suit and tie. It's as if this isn't the same man we saw in that 1939 portrait, even though only 3 years had passed. To call my grandfather an employee is like calling somebody who was on a cotton plantation an independent contractor. I mean, it's absurd. He was a slave laborer. And there was to be more of that. He eventually was able to go back home, but things did not get better. And we'll turn to the next slide. Okay. It seemed there was a good chance that there would be, in this case, a happy ending. Because as my grandfather wrote to my father late November of 41, things were moving well. He pointed out that a letter from the local Cuba embassy also arrived. As soon as we get our passports here, we can get our ship tickets. They couldn't get directly into the United States, but if they got into Cuba, they would be safe, and it wasn't apparently as hard to get from Cuba to the US as it was to get from Germany. So it looked like they would have a safe landing. And my father raised the money for their tickets and sent the money to them. But, John, can you do 2 clicks for a second? Okay. But there was a delay. As my grandfather wrote, we are waiting every day for the passports and are disappointed about the apparent delay. The delay came about because the Nazis, after making life uncomfortable, then stealing the income and property of Jews, adopted a third and even more progressive stage. They adopted what became known as, in German language, as the final solution to the Jewish problem. And it was very simple, very straightforward. Germany would now seek to kill every Jew everywhere. Any Jew who was under the control of the Nazis, and remember, Germany had been expanding to the east, conquering Poland and most of the other countries in that area. And so there were lots of Jews within close range, in addition to the German Jews who were still there. So my grandparents didn't realize that the reason their passports were not coming is because there were no passports. And Germany was only setting up the mechanism by which they could kill them. So we'll turn to, the next slide is interesting for a number of reasons. You've seen my father several times, and you realize, he was talking straight at the audience. He even told some dad jokes and all that, and very comfortable. And I want you just to notice the change of tone in the same way that my grandfather's physical features just changed. Watch and listen to how my father spoke, and I think you'll get a sense of how he explains what happened to his parents.
My father stayed here. I went back home to my mother, and actually was killed in one of the extermination camps.
So this again is not the same person that we saw earlier when he starts talking about what happened to his parents. So all he knew here is that they had been sent to several places in Poland. And we'll have the next slide, please. Click again, John. Okay. In the Holocaust Memorial Center in Israel, Yad Vashem, they have a large collection of what are called transport lists. These were lists compiled by the Gestapo. The Gestapo were the military and police, really, of the Nazi movement. And they compared lists of Jews who were to be sent to the East. And to the East essentially meant to their deaths. The first person on the list, Johanna Zadek, is actually Regina's sister. She had been married young to another German Jewish man who fought in the German army in World War I and had been killed. And you might have thought being the widow of a soldier killed in action would have somehow excused her from this fate, but the Nazis simply didn't care. And then you see my grandparents listed after her. So 3 of them together were sent to Poland to a labor camp called Troniki. And the labor camp is kind of, again, a euphemism for what was a terrible place where there were huge numbers of people who died because of the conditions in that area. And we'll see, again, what they were. When my father arrived in the United States, he registered for the military draft the next year. And in 1942, and I'll get back to the narrative in a moment, in 1942 he was called up for military service. But the military wanted to make sure that they could trust him, because legally he was what was called an enemy alien. He was German, and the US was fighting a war against Germany. So could they rely upon him? Well, my father attached an addendum to his questionnaire, which I found in the United States Archives in Kansas City. And he wrote 3 of the most chilling paragraphs I've ever read, just to deal with the first one first. At the last minute, I received a letter stating that my parents had been deported sometime in April of this year from Berlin to the address given. Thus, he wrote, I have reason to believe that they may not be alive anymore. Since I know that diseases are raging in that area, and besides, these people are not being fed by the Nazis. So my father, alone in the United States, had a very good sense that his parents probably died, or may well have died in the camp due to starvation, due to disease, due to the cold, or whatever. Then he went on to tell the United States that he was no enemy alien. And he simply said that on or about November 21st, 1941, the Nazis have revoked my citizenship by decree, which provides that every Jewish person who lives abroad and indicates that he will stay abroad loses the German citizenship. And finally, to make it clear how much he wanted to fight, he said, to prove that I am definitely an enemy of the Nazis, I will only have to state that I am Jewish. I, for one, have a personal score to settle with the Nazis, which includes revenge for 3 weeks in a concentration camp where I was taken only because I am Jewish. The army was persuaded. He was drafted into the army, did his basic training at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, was studying field artillery when he was suddenly sent to a special training program in Stanford University in California, and then to the U.S. Military Intelligence Center in Camp Ritchie, Maryland. I did not know at the time, nor did he ever tell me, that he was trained in interviewing German prisoners of war in Germany during World War II. Okay. Next slide. My father died without knowing exactly what happened to his parents. After the war, the newly reconstituted German government undertook a wonderful project, in a way, in which they wanted to document the fate of every Jew who had lived in Germany from the beginning of the Nazi period to the end. And they compiled literally hundreds of volumes of information. The volume that begins with S has a listing for my grandparents. It refers to Kurt Schoenwald, giving his birthday and his place of birth accurately, pointing out he lived in Dresden and Berlin. He didn't actually live in Dresden, but I guess Gross-Rossdorf was too hard to spell or something. They pointed out that he had been arrested and then interred in concentration camp Buchenwald until November 27, 1938, and confirmed that he was deported from Berlin to the Piaski ghetto, which was the place where the Jewish slave laborers lived next to the Trauniki camp. And that's all, except for this German phrase, which also appeared in the information about my grandmother. And that term simply means declared dead. We don't know if they survived Trauniki. We don't know if something happened to them, but the best evidence we have, and this is hard to hear, is that they were ultimately transported, along with most of the Jews from that area, to a concentration camp also in Poland called Sobibor. And the odds are that when they arrived, because they were in their 60s, they would either be marched directly to the gas chambers and be poisoned, or they would be taken against a wall somewhere and shot down by machine gun. So that's the most specific information we have. Now, as I told you when I began, it's not a story with a happy ending, but a story that I think has a satisfactory ending. And that's because of things that started many decades later. Next slide, John. On November 9th, again, that date of 2008, the town of Gross-Rossdorf unveiled a monument to my grandparents. They had been the only Jews in the town. And this was largely the work of 3 men in the town, the leader of whom was the Lutheran pastor for the town, who is, I consider, one of my closest friends. If you look at the picture on the right, it seems this doesn't look like a military or a war memorial does. To me, what it looks like is the headstone on a grave. And that's indeed how our family has treated it. There is a Jewish tradition that when you visit a Jewish cemetery and to visit a grave, you leave a stone on the top of the headstone or somewhere on the grave. It's just one of those traditions that develops. And if you look carefully along the top of that, you'll probably see there are several stones there. Because my brother, his daughter, my wife, my daughter, we were all there for the unveiling of this monument. There's something that's a little interesting that you might see about this other picture, which was taken by my daughter. Excuse me. First of all, this this memorial sits on a pedestrian island just across the street from the old Kaufhaus Schanwald. And you can see on the right side the reflection of that building, looking just like it did when it was built by my grandfather and family in 1928. The other thing that's a little unusual is you might look at my, my grandmother's neck, and what you will see there is something white that looks like, some sort of flaw, or maybe it was, it was a stain of some kind. Norbert, who ran this project, insisted that the monument be covered, the part that tells the story, with bulletproof glass. He didn't want anybody to be able to successfully deface it. The text tells the story very clearly and without pulling any punches about the town's failure to rescue their only Jewish family. Norbert also, however, wanted to make sure that people understood the violence that accompanied their lives. And so at several different places, he hit a hammer on the glass. And the glass didn't disappear, but it developed these imperfections. And he thought that sent a very powerful message. As important as this was, it's not the whole story, because something else happened as well, and you'll see this on the next slide. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to show the news story that's up there. I was contacted some years later by a teacher at a local high school in Lincoln, Nebraska, who wanted to write a play about our family. He was teaching the Holocaust, and he thought connected to somebody who is from Lincoln. And so I was able to loan to him the roughly 100 letters I found that my grandparents had written to my father. I found those in his files after he had died. I had no idea of any of this until I stumbled across this. And Chris Maley, the teacher at Lincoln High, wrote a play which he called Ghosts on the Wall, which was a term I had used for some magazines articles that I had written. And that play was performed in Gainesville at the annual Holocaust commemoration ceremony that we hold here every year. And then the people who arranged that play, the Actors Warehouse, a local repertory group we have in Gainesville, put on the play at their own stage in Gainesville, and it ran for 2 weeks with a lot of people attending. I should point out the original show was first appeared at the high school where the teacher taught, and then it was recorded and streamed during the COVID period so people could see it. The last or latest factor that I think is giving Kurt and Regina Schanwald an afterlife and giving my parents the recognition they deserve for surviving is a new book that I have written that will be released officially on November 9th, the anniversary of Kristallnacht, which really deranged their lives. And the book is also called The Ghost on the Wall, a grandson's memoir of the Holocaust. And it's about the three generations, my grandparents, my parents, and what the Holocaust has meant to us, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people. As I said, I find this outcome not happy, but satisfactory, because through their letters and through their story, I got to meet my grandparents. I never met them face-to-face. I never spoke to them directly, but I learned about who they were, the courage that they showed, and the goodness that they managed to promote in life. And I knew that they were not just nameless victims. They were my grandparents, people who would have loved me if they hadn't been murdered during the Holocaust. And I hope that these stories will prompt you to think about ways that you can incorporate the Holocaust in your studies. I should point out that Mr. Maley and I own the copyright on the play. It's a relatively easy play to stage, and we would be happy to grant permission to any of the schools or school groups that might like to put it on. I want to close by thanking you for your attention and expressing my willingness to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much. Yeah.